What's up, everybody? How many of you guys were on here doing the alt history research thing prior to 2017? Because I just stumbled across one of these old school docs that actually made YouTube what it is. And it's actually quite depressing. I mean, this is a phenomenal documentary, don't get me wrong, and I'll leave a link to it on my posts page. But it reminds me of the wealth of information we had on here prior to everything getting filtered. And none of this was, well, maybe this, maybe that. It was, this is what happened. Look it up for yourself. We know what happened. These guys are freaking insane. And we'll get to some examples of that. But from 2017 to 2019, every couple months was a huge purge. Do you guys remember that? I mean, every 6 months, my entire subscription catalog would all be 404. And this really sucks in a couple of ways. First off, the entire first generation of YouTube creators that were saying anything worth listening to were brick-walled from all mass media sources for life, which wrecked tens of thousands of lives. But then also everything that they talked about has been scrubbed from any searches. I spent like 7 years absorbing everything I could before I ever started a channel. And by the time I did, it was perfectly clear they were changing out the old guard. And the newest cutting edge finds in historical research all of a sudden became, it's all fake. I'll address that in a minute, but the entire first generation of researchers, which there were some really smart people in there, had done a really good job of explaining this timeline that I've got going here. And the one thing that we really didn't understand at that time was the disaster cycle. So when you figured that in, you understand that there was a power vacuum that was created. But we knew all about the Church of Rome, the societies, and you got to keep in mind the Red Shills didn't come on the scene till the 1800s. Yeah, I've done many videos on their attempted financial conquest prior to that, but these other groups have been at it for 600-700 years, and that's what the whole first generation of YouTubers exposed. They just rug pulled anybody talking about these things. They didn't break any of the rules. And then without any warning whatsoever, their livelihoods were snatched away from them. I remember hearing about 3 or 4 people that self-deleted from other creators that knew them. I mean, this is how they were making their living. And then who knows how many more got shadow banned. You know, I'm one of the lucky ones. Well, I'm one of the lucky ones in the unlucky group. But here were some of the channels that were around in 2019 at the end of the purge. 91,000 subs and they average about 4,000. 90% of their audience doesn't know that they're making videos still. 420,000 subs, averaging 2 or 3,000. Not only do they hide your channel, but if you talk about any sensitive topics, then you get restricted. So sorry if I have to tiptoe around with my words sometimes, but we're not all on the same settings here. Today, everybody knows about the Red Shields, but don't forget that the Catholics colonized most of the world. Then they managed to blame it on Christianity in general and make it where people no longer distinguish between Protestant and Catholic, when the reality is this. And guys, I'm not talking about the people that happen to go to mass at this place. It's the people that run this organization, because it's one of the most powerful in the world, has been for a long time, and that attracts certain types of people. Here's an example of their modus operandi.
Completely been emptied of their own personalities, and upon the order of their commander will do exactly what they're told. There's no such thing as a disobedient Jesuit. They're all under orders. They've been trained for 15 years. They're soldiers. They're more of a Marine Corps than the Marines. The Marines were fashioned after
these guys are McUltra.
You break the man down in boot camp, you rob him of his personality, you shave his head, you put all the same clothes on him, they're all treated the same, they're treated like dirt, we're going to rob you of your will so that we can mold you into what we want.
So we also used to have firsthand accounts from people like this, and all of the people putting out the good info were basically Protestant preachers. And it was basically because either they went to seminary school and realized what had happened, or it had come down from their granddaddies. But there's old guys like this. This was my grandfather's generation, and I'm telling you, they're no nonsense people. My grandpa's generation was very stern, and one thing they didn't joke around about was God. I grew up around all kinds of church aldermans and stuff, and they're not ones to make up stories. The audio sucks here for a second, but it gets better.
One great big mansion. where the folks were rich in that area, and cars all around it and so forth. But I went up the door, and I was pretty sure this fellow's Catholic, so I gave him a Catholic canvas. And he invited me in, and then as soon as he got in, he turned the key in the door, and I said, wait a minute, what am I getting into? He opened another door into a great big mammoth parlor and a great big mammoth dining room with double doors in between, and all seated around the whole business was prelates, some from Europe and all the big ones from America. They were planning the Eucharistic Congress in Chicago. That was way back in the 1920s. And when they started talking to me, they tried to get me to be one of them and offered me every kind of a conceivable opportunity that you could think of. They offered me everything: money, scholarship, and the whole works, and told me the advantage of being Catholic and what they were planning on doing in America and with America. They said, we're going to take over America, and we've already got it fixed, so know how in the world can they escape becoming under our authority, and where we'll be in the jurisdiction and take over. I said, well, how are you going to take over the South? It's predominantly Protestant. It says we're going to seed the South with Catholic families. And then when they marry into the Protestants, their children will be raised Catholic, and before long we'll have a quarter, and then we'll have a third, then we'll have over half, and when we get over half, we've got America. That's one way of doing it. But it says that we've got other ways too. Well, I said, supposing all this was known, and the people, Protestants, knew this, he said, if they knew what we were planning on doing, there'd be bloodshed in 24 hours, and lots of it in 48. I said, are you prepared to take over in case that happens? He said, yes, we have our standing armies. We have everything all prepared with guns, ammunition, and the whole works. And said, we can take over, and you might as well join us and be with us and get in on the right side of the fence. I said to him, I said, listen, there is nothing you can do to invigorate me to become a Jesuit. Now, how many graduated last year? And they told me. And then I said the year before that, and they told me, and I went back to it. We had about 3,800 people graduating out in the field. And I said, well, what do you boys do when you go out in the field? No, I said, at first I want to know how many graduate next year. Well, it said it'll be somewhere under 900 anyway. And I said, how about, what do you do when you graduate? He said, well, the first thing we change our names. And when we change our names, then we're allocated so many to this church, so many to that church, and to another church. And I said, when you go out to the churches, then what do you do? He said, well, first thing we do is look around for some nice young ladies we'd like to make an associate member with, and then we marry them. And after we're married, we go off to a Protestant theological seminary or school, and we come out a Protestant minister. Then we're taught to, in our course, to work up to the heads as fast as we can in that line.
So back in the 1920s, when the comrades were just getting their foot in the door in America, this one institute in Chicago with their priests living in huge mansions was pumping out 1,000 foot soldiers every year to go out and infiltrate the Protestant world. And that's 50 years after Samuel Morse wrote a book about them flooding America with Catholic noobs. It's just old school conquest to go in and breed out the native population. And like they said there, the first thing that you're supposed to do when you go out in the field is find you a good girl and get married and have a bunch of babies. And it's the same exact thing that has just been amplified recently. If you have never read this, you should pause and read it. I will hang, burn, waste, boil, flay, strangle, and burn alive those infamous heretics. Rip open the crush their in order to annihilate their inexorable race. When it can't be done openly, I will use secret methods. They're not joking around, and nothing has changed. They're playing a generational game against people that don't even know they're playing a game. This is why I always stress that we're not living in a Mr. Burns controlled scenario. It's much more of a mob rule mentality. Only not the mob of the masses, but of the families. And nowadays it gets kind of blurry on who infiltrated who, but these were the rival world superpowers back in the day. Like today we have USA, Russia, China. Well, after the 1300s catastrophes, then the Venetian nobility basically took over world trade. And then you had the Church of Rome, which was basically Florence, the center of culture. But they went on to form the entire Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment period. But for every name or group that you've heard of, there are 10 that you haven't. When was the last time you heard about the Contarinis? Well, probably never, but he was the Jorge Zorro behind Martin Luther, John Calvin, and even Iggy of Loyola. There are still old world families dotted all across Europe that has the wealth of nations. Only they've got enough clout that history remembers them favorably and will never be mentioned by the media unless they want to.
Infiltration of churches and religious institutions as well as government.
Well, we all know how that turned out for Lincoln. Don't have to go into it right now. But did you know that 3 of the first 5 presidents all expired on the 4th of July? Jefferson and Adams within hours of each other on the same day. And then Monroe on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. If you go watch the video, they explain how they all had the exact same similar condition within 2 or 3 days, went from healthy to gone in 2 or 3 days. And they explained why it happened and who did it. There was certain legislation they opposed that right after their demise, well, it was all passed. The message was sent loud and clear. And it's not just these 3. There are more presidents that all came down with the exact same peculiar condition. And I know what I'm showing on the screen here appears to be a gray matter, and it is. But the people that actually were in close proximity to all of these presidents, and they know the names of each one, but they were all agents of Rome. It seems like you would learn in school about the amazing coincidence that 3 of the first 5 presidents all expired on July 4th. But like I've been talking about for years on here, their specialty is education. And they've been at it for about 500 years or better. Way back in the 1500s, it was a capital crime for one of them to be caught teaching in England. And even our own country here was founded just 3 years after they were expelled from here. They've used the exact same playbook on hundreds of countries over hundreds of years.
Robert Schuller, Paul Crouch, Hal Lindsey, Pat Robertson, James Dobson, all of these men, they're not protesting. What they have become are agents of Rome. I remember back when I was starting my student teaching, I was teaching 7th grade history to young people talking about the Pilgrims and Puritans coming over to America. The book said absolutely nothing about why they were coming to America. And I was just reading, and I've got a book here called the
can't say that.
Money Trust, and also a book about
and they don't like you talking about him either.
Rockefeller File by Gary Allen. But these people have set up trusts, and they have rewritten the history books. They have rewritten the history books so that the 7th grade history book that I was teaching out of said nothing about the Reformation.
Okay, so like I said at the beginning of the video, in 2019, all alt history became, it's all fake. And all of a sudden, I saw hundreds and thousands of creators coming on here that had never looked at history in the least little bit, and all of a sudden they're experts because it's all fake. So we can just make up whatever shit we want, and they did. And in the process, they erased all of the truth that people had been exposing for a decade. Now, as far as history is a lie, that's true, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It's a lie like this. Everybody knows what happened on the day after January 5th, right? That's going to go down in the history books as an insurrection. But since we lived through it and got the live play-by-play, anybody that cared to keep up with it, we know that everything that is written down about it is just spin. Well, that's how our history is, at least for the last 600 years. Yes, there was a Renaissance, expulsion from Spain, French Revolution, American Revolution. But what we're told about all of it is BS. And this just goes to show how deeply embedded in education they really are. We just call this event the Protestant Reformation. At best, they'll call it the European Wars of Religion. But this was hundreds of years of G-siding all Protestants, The Protestants were running from them coming to America. And I can show you clips of preachers from the 1950s that preach what their granddaddies taught them, and they say that Rome is the Antichrist. They remembered that the Holy Fathers crusaded against them for hundreds of years. But now we just call this the Protestant Reformation, and there's no difference between Protestants and Catholics. They're all just Christians, right? Well, no, that's not right, and I'll show you their oath here in a minute, but I'm sure these numbers are low right here. It was probably twice that, but if you look at the famous conflicts of history, it's not even in there. That is what real espionage looks like. Nobody even suspects them anymore. Yeah, everybody talks about the Greys all the time, and the two will join forces to weaken the GUI. But let me put this into perspective for you. The Greys have a wall from a Roman fortress with a Muslim mosque on top of it that they pray to. They can't even hold things together on this lump of sand in the middle of nowhere. The cat's out of the bag. Everybody knows what they're up to now. But the Catholics have this magnificent city that people come from all around the world to visit. They have cathedrals in every major city and every first world country, while the entire world has forgot what they did for hundreds of years and think that the Pope is a nice grandfatherly type. Everybody seriously underestimates this group. Just in cash flow alone, not including all of their real estate and assets. There are 1 billion Catholics worldwide, and they all tithe 10% of their income to this organization. So on the low side, we'll say $50 a week, an average tithe. That's $50 billion every single week, tax-free from the local government. And they don't have to pay the expenses of a standing army. They just have an army of generals. So anyway, it was great to come across one of these old school docs. I invite you to go watch it. The link will be in my posts, because you will learn more truth in 2 hours on something like this than entire channels will ever even speak about. What has become, quote, truth on YouTube was invented by people who thought everybody was supposed to be living in log cabins in the 1800s. And now AI is pumping out thousands of hours of this crap.
What if the world we live in is not the world humanity built, but what remained after a catastrophe so total, so abrupt, that entire civilizations were wiped clean from memory and replaced with a new version of history overnight? What if the year 1700 was not just another date on a calendar, but the moment someone pressed a reset button on the entire timeline of humanity? The deeper we look, the stranger it becomes. And it all begins with images, silent, precise, and unsettlingly real, left to us by the so-called ruin artists of the 16th and 17th century.
Yeah, ruin artists, huh? And now they're not even using actual images, it's just AI images. But that's what history has become on here, just looking at old images. Wow, congratulations, genius. You just figured out that people have been living in cities for thousands of years. In places like this. But since they've seen a Clint Eastwood movie and Vikings on TV, then that's what history is. Now everybody just talks about the buildings. We used to talk about the people that paid for these buildings. I mean, what? Did the Tatarians all hold hands and sing Kumbaya while the drones built these? And then they just throw out random dates. Oh, in the 1700s, civilization ended, and nobody even remembers. I mean, I've heard everything is a reset. The Magdalene Day floods, reset. The Great London Fire, reset. Great Chicago Fire, reset. 1906 San Francisco earthquake, reset. Everything's a reset. And these people aren't quite bright enough to figure out that they are using historical events to say that all history is fake. Not everything but this, because this supports my story. These people obviously weren't around or paying attention to the previous decade of truth on here. And now they're the ones doing the most to hide the actual truth from the next generation. And all I can do is refer to Brandolini's law. The amount of time and energy needed to refute bullshit is orders of magnitude larger than the time it takes to produce bullshit. And it takes zero knowledge or actual research to come on here and just say, oh, it's all fake. So we're just going to look at pictures. It's sad. We lost a lot here. Every video on here for the last decade was showing what happened over the last 500 years. And when the internet learned about the catastrophe cycle, everybody acts like this happens every 2 weeks. That's why the first thing I did was look back through the timeline to see where the break was. The last big one was in the 1300s, and no, they can't just erase something like this from history. That's why they just say it was the plague. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.